UD Women's Leadership Initiative issues call to action for gender equity. Editor's note: Lynn Evans, director of the Women's Leadership Initiative at the University of Delaware, offers a call to action for equity in the workplace in this essay on International Women's Day, Monday, March 8. WLI will share additional videos from the UD community on Instagram, Twitter and LinkedIn this week on what gender equity will look like in a post-COVID-19 world. For a very brief period in early 2020, women slightly outnumbered men in total employment according to the U.S. By this measure, it appeared as if women were finally making economic progress. Labor Department. Although the figure did not take into account earnings disparities or other inequities borne out through a deeper dive into the data, it was nonetheless a milestone in the fight for gender equity in the workplace. Then the coronavirus, COVID-19, hit and the status of women globally changed dramatically. The impact of the novel coronavirus has been swift, decisive and ravaging, but perhaps no more so for any group than women and particularly women of color. Consider that in December 2020, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that of the 227,000 jobs lost that month, 87% were held by women. This year, celebrating the accomplishments and contributions of women during Women's History Month and on International Women's Day means grappling with the decimation of years of progress toward gender parity and trying to determine what comes next. Assessing the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on women with children at home has been particularly devastating. With children in K-12 or distance learning by mid-2020, Census Bureau, approximately 93% of families in the U.S. according to the U.S. Daycare centers closed and families suddenly had no way to cope with the demands of jobs and the needs of families. Prior to the pandemic, women in the U.S. compared to men, manage 3 times the work necessary to support a family, including housework, childcare and elder care. Noted scholar and activist Silvia Federici refers to this as reproductive labor, and it encompasses all essential work that sustains us, and that economies tend not to recognize or compensate. Because of the pandemic, these responsibilities could not be outsourced, leaving women to shoulder the burden and suffer the consequences, including physical and mental health issues, and the inability to continue working. Have dropped out of the workforce in the past year. A CBS report estimates that as many as 3 million women in the U.S. When, if ever, will these women re-enter the workforce, and, if they do, what are the long-term impacts to their careers and earning potential? The COVID-19 pandemic hasn't created wage disparities but has highlighted what decades-old research supports. In short, unpaid reproductive labor has always been a contributor to overall lower incomes for women. And the impact of the pandemic is not equally distributed. The New York Times has noted, this crisis has a predominantly non-white, female face. Consider that women of color are more likely to be employed in industries subject to COVID-19 related layoffs or are engaged in essential industries that do not provide work-from-home options, and subjects these workers to increased exposure to COVID-19. Those least able to withstand the economic and health impacts of COVID-19 are bearing the brunt of the crisis. Where do we go from here? It can be incredibly difficult to have perspective when struggling with day-to-day demands and amidst great uncertainty. But, for many women, this quote from Madeleine Albright about what she learned from her parents during the Holocaust rings true. Albright said, namely, "My parents had no control over the bombs that were falling, the only thing they had control over was their behavior." And I think that's very important now because we don't have any control over how the virus started, but we do have control over our behavior in these situations. Wendy Smith, professor of management at the University of Delaware's Alfred Lerner College of Business and Economics and co-founder of the Women's Leadership Initiative, WLI, focuses attention on our individual behaviors to manage crises. Smith, who also serves as faculty director of WLI's Women's Leadership Programs, references the leadership research of American scholar Warren Bennis, who set out 3 requirements to successfully lead self and others: know yourself, know the context and be adaptive. However, the third element requires that we are dynamic. The first 2 features may seem more static, explained Smith. This feature of great leadership reminds us that we cannot take the knowledge about ourselves or our context for granted. There has never been a more important time to be growing and changing as we confront and try to navigate in a global pandemic. A massive external disruption to all of our lives and organizations. For professional women, this is the time to be introspective and consider other possibilities. If your passions lie elsewhere, or your employer is not in a place to support women in a real way, this is the time to plan your next steps. Be clear about your priorities, whether they be flex time, ability to take sabbaticals, family leave, paid childcare, diversity policies, etc. Geographical limitations may be a thing of the past, and the best companies will be recruiting without location considerations. Are not in positions that allow them the luxury of choice. That said, we also know that many women in the U.S. Many of our country's frontline workers in industries such as accommodation, food service, retail and transportation have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and may not have the resources or support to find a new job that provides better opportunities for women to advance. Private sector, we know that these frontline workers are disproportionately Black and Hispanic, based on the recent landmark McKinsey study on Black workers in the U.S. Part of addressing bringing women back into the workforce post-pandemic must also include meeting the needs of these women, who have historically been marginalized in many conversations about gender equity in the workplace. Therefore, the larger issue for society is how to put structural changes in place to protect from the inevitable disruptions of crises like COVID-19. The impact to our society of not addressing gender inequities is real, and solving these issues is not only a moral imperative but necessary for long-term economic sustainability. Just as companies with diverse leadership teams are more profitable than their competitors, the same applies to countries. According to McKinsey research, the economic benefits of narrowing gender gaps are 6 to 8 times higher than the social spending required. Going forward, what will our priorities be in terms of public policy, and will we have the resolve to plan long-term and allocate resources that support essential workers? Schools and childcare? As former Prime Minister of Australia Julia Gillard notes, when times are tough, as they are now, the future of society rests on the shoulders of those who are prepared to go to work and care for others. Broadly and disproportionately, those workers are women. The COVID-19 pandemic hasn't created wage disparities but has highlighted what decades-old research supports. In short, unpaid reproductive labor has always been a contributor to overall lower incomes for women. And the impact of the pandemic is not equally distributed. The New York Times has noted, this crisis has a predominantly non-white, female face. Consider that women of color are more likely to be employed in industries subject to COVID-19 related layoffs or are engaged in essential industries that do not provide work-from-home options, and subjects these workers to increased exposure to COVID-19. Those least able to withstand the economic and health impacts of COVID-19 are bearing the brunt of the crisis.